come now to the final part, or the final video, let's say, on Descartes. And we're going to be looking at the second major goal of Meditation 6. But it's not just a goal of Meditation 6. It's one of the major goals of the entire work. There's a subtitle to the work that highlights the fact that Descartes is going to prove that God exists, and that he's going to talk about the relationship between the body and the mind. God has played a huge role in the meditations almost throughout. It's bringing up the possibility that God can deceive him about anything. That gets the evil demon worry going in Meditation 1. It's God's not the first thing proven that we can be certain about. That's ourselves. But it's the second thing, right? God is the second major proof of something that you know exists, even given these skeptical worries. And more importantly, God is the key to getting rid of all those skeptical worries, according to Descartes. According to Descartes, belief in God is necessary for all knowledge. Knowledge of God is necessary for almost all other knowledge. The only knowledge you could have, according to Descartes, if you didn't know that God existed, would be knowledge of yourself, self-knowledge. Now, self-knowledge is the way to get to knowledge of God. So it's not like self-knowledge isn't important. It's at the foundation of everything. But God is like the only thing less significant than self-knowledge. Knowledge of God is the only thing less significant than self-knowledge in the entire work. And so you might think, well, God's been in it kind of throughout, right? Meditation 3 is about proving God. Meditation 4 is about dealing with a problem that arises because of God and the way God figures in the solution to the skeptical worries. Then Meditation 5 is all about proving God again. Why has Descartes saved what was supposed to be the second major topic of this work for Meditation 6? Especially when Meditation 6 is partly bound up in psychological questions about the imagination, about the nature of material objects, things like that, about proving that external objects exist. Well, actually, without being as explicit about it, Descartes' been providing us with the key theorems, you might say, of his overall theory of the human mind throughout. Now, I'm going to be talking about the human mind here, whereas with Plato and Aristotle, I talked about the soul. There's not much to this. Nowadays, there are people who make a big distinction between the mind and the soul. So if you're a Marvel fan, the mind has one infinity stone or infinity gem, and the soul has another infinity stone or infinity gem. Like, they're very different things. They're really just different names for the same basic thing. Or rather, that's not quite right, especially given Aristotle. For Aristotle, the soul is more than just the mind. You might think that the mind for Aristotle is just the rational part and the perceptual or sensitive part, whereas the nutritive part of the soul doesn't really have anything to do with the mind. But for Plato, the mind and the soul are basically identical. Like, what we talk about when we talk about the mind is basically the same thing that Plato's talking about when he talks about the soul. And the word for soul in Greek is psyche, which is where we get psyche for psychology, which is the study of the mind. Not a big difference here. So when Descartes is talking about the relationship between the soul and the mind, he's talking about substantially, or the mind and the body rather, he's talking about substantially the same issue that Plato and Aristotle were talking about when they talked about the relationship between the soul and the body. And Descartes is going to have a position that's basically the same as Plato's. There are some differences, but not a lot. Descartes is going to end up saying your mind rather, is an immaterial thing. It controls your material body. He's also going to say that not everything you ordinarily think of as being part of your mind is part of that immaterial thing. He's going to say that there's an aspect of your mind, the imagination, which isn't essentially part of your immaterial mind. The same way that Plato and Aristotle would have said there are parts of your soul that aren't essentially part of the same non-physical thing. So for Plato, the appetitive part of the soul, and probably also thumos, the spirited part of the soul, aren't part of the non-physical thing. In fact, they can't be, according to Plato, because the non-physical thing doesn't have parts. Okay, so why spend time on Descartes' account of the mind if it's going to be substantially the same theory as Plato's. The reason is that Descartes' arguments are different. Descartes' arguments for the non-identity of the mind and body, right? The non-identity of mind and body are going to hinge around this issue of conceivability. That really everything in the Meditations has hinged around. For Aristotle, the key kind of evidence you appealed to was observational evidence. Right? If you wanted to know about the human mind, you watched how human beings behave, or the human soul rather, you watched how human beings behaved. And you figured out from there. For Plato, it was a little more inward looking than that. But it was still about like paying attention to the things that happened within your own soul. So the big thing for Plato in saying that the soul has parts, at least in the Republic, was taking or paying close attention to the element of psychic conflict, internal psychic conflict. And in the Phaedo, the arguments have to do not so much with conceivability. It has to do with, well, we're already convinced that the forms exist. If the forms exist, then what must the soul be like, given that the soul grasps the forms? For Descartes, it all comes back to what can be conceived. Right? What can your mind tell you is possible? And right from the beginning, Descartes was considering the possibility that the mind could exist without the body. That's, after all, exactly what was happening in the evil demon skeptical scenario. Descartes was conceiving of a possible scenario, one where there's this all-powerful being who's tricking you into thinking you have a body. But if the evil demon is tricking you into thinking you have a body, then it must be the case that you don't have one. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a trick. So when you're imagining or conceiving of the possibility that the evil demon is tricking you into thinking you have a body, you're at that time conceiving of a scenario where you don't have one, but where you do have a mind. Because remember, that's the thing the evil demon can't trick you into thinking you have, because you need a mind to be tricked in the first place. So it can't be false that you have a mind. That's what the Cogito is there to do. Meditations 1 and 2, by themselves, established that the mind can be conceived of as separate from the body, because you can conceive of scenarios where you have a mind but don't have a body. And if you can conceive of it, then, according to Descartes, it's possible. Conceivability entails possibility. And if it's possible for the mind to exist without the body, then they can't be identical, right? That doesn't make sense. Like, think of anything else that's identical. Think of two things that are actually identical. Think of Clark Kent and Superman. Can Clark Kent exist without Superman? Well, no. I mean, Clark Kent can, like, not get dressed up in his clown outfit to go save people. He could even lose his powers, but that would be Superman losing his powers. He could no longer go by the name Superman, but that would be Superman no longer responding to the name Superman. Superman is the name of that dude. That dude has another name, Clark Kent, but they're both names for the same thing. They can't exist apart from each other. Where there's Clark Kent, there's Superman. If you want a much more poetic version of this, watch the end of Kill Bill Volume 2. But Clark Kent can't not be Superman. The morning star and the evening star, they're the same thing. They're Venus, right? At least I think that's right. I could be screwing up that example. But anyway, I think it's right. If it's not, I'll put a little addendum at the end of this video saying, hey, I looked it up and I was wrong. And if you don't see that, that means either I was right or I forgot to look it up. But let's work on the assumption that the morning star and the evening star are both names for the same thing, that one thing being Venus. That means you can't have the morning star without the evening star. You can have something weird happen at Earth orbit so that, like, Venus no longer shows up in the morning. It only shows up in the evening. Maybe that's possible. I don't know. Maybe like some big-ass asteroid hits Venus maybe and like knocks Venus's orbit off, so Venus shows up at different times, different places in the sky. But it would still be the same thing. They're different names for the same thing. If the mind and the body are actually identical, then they're just different names for the same thing. Or what's more likely, that the mind is identical to a part of the body, like the nervous system as a whole, right? Like nobody thinks if you lose your toes, you've lost part of your mind. So the mind probably isn't identical to the body as a whole, but it's identical to some part of the body. In which case, the mind would just be your brain plus the rest of your nervous system, right? It would be the same thing. You couldn't have one without the other. Well, if you went along with the skeptical scenario in meditation 1, and you went along with the cogito, the I think, therefore I am, then you've already gone along with the idea that there can be scenarios where your mind exists, but your body doesn't. So they can't be identical. Right? Another way of seeing it is if the mind was the body, then everything true of the body would be true of the mind. Or if the mind is only identical to a part of the body, anything true of that part of the body, like the brain and the nervous system, would be true of the mind. But what we've seen is that there's a fact about the body which isn't true of the mind. In the evil demon scenario, the body wouldn't exist, but the mind would. And so, if conceivability entails possibility, if the fact that you can conceive of the evil demon scenario means it was a possible scenario, which is what got this whole thing rolling in the first place, the idea that here's a possibility that if it were true, our beliefs would be false about almost everything. And so we have to rule out that possibility because knowledge requires 100% certainty. So conceivability entailing possibility was like baked in right from the beginning. You can tell that because there was no evidence ever offered that there was anything that showed that the evil demon was possible other than the fact that he could think of it. He could think of the possibility coherently. If that's the case, then the mind just isn't the body. Right? Further, right? So there we have a non-identity claim. Now that non-identity claim doesn't on its own show that the mind is immaterial. Right? The mind could be a different material thing than the body. And to get you to the claim that the mind isn't material, you just have to add the extra little bit that in the evil demon scenario, you're imagining that there's no physical things at all, right? That there's just the ideas. And here we get to the other really big important difference between the mind and the body. As we saw, and it also explains why the proof of the external world and the mind-body stuff happen in the same meditation. As we saw, our access to physical objects in the external world is not immediate. It's indirect. We have direct access to these secondary qualities, right? But the secondary qualities are not essential features of external objects. We have to make inferences from secondary qualities to primary qualities, and those are the essential features of physical objects. We have indirect access to physical things. We can only gain knowledge about, or get evidence about even, physical things by making inferences from secondary qualities. Or in other words, right, like I'm going to draw my head. I have a pretty big nose. It's also kind of crookedy. Some of you might have noticed that. Some of you might have also noticed I talk more out of one side of my mouth than the other. I'm incapable of talking out of two sides of my mouth. That was supposed to be funny, if you didn't know. All right, so there's me, right? And let's say my mind's in here. This is exactly what Descartes' saying isn't true, but whatever. And let's say I'm looking at a box, right? Because a box is one of the few things I can kind of competently draw. Here's the way Descartes thinks of it. We don't directly perceive the box. What's going on is inside the mind, there is an image of the box, an image that is composed entirely out of colors, if it's a visual image, but if you wanted to add more to it, sounds, odors, flavors, all that secondary quality stuff. What happens is the box causes the representation of the box, but the representation of the box is just its sensory or secondary qualities. And so all our mind has access to is this thing, the representation of the box. We don't ever have direct access to the box. We have a guarantee because of God's existence and God's beneficent nature, that the representation of the box is going to be a good guide to the actual nature of the real box. Without God, right, you'd be in the skeptical scenario. You'd be in a scenario where you'd have no idea whether your representation of the box matches the box. Right? This idea that we don't have direct access to objects in the external world, we only have access to our mental representations of them, was another thing that was key to the whole project of the book. Without that, it could be argued that, well, we don't need to worry about skepticism, right? How do I know that I have a hand, to use a very famous example from the early 20th century, very famous among philosophy nerds, no reason for you to know about it. How do I know I have a hand or that hands exist? Easy. Here's one hand. Here's the second hand. Ta-da, right? I am looking at the hands. Couldn't be looking at the hands if there weren't any hands. Well, Descartes would respond as well. Actually, what's going on is your mind is accessing representations of the hands. There is no reason to think that, without God anyway, without God as being part of the story, Descartes would say, there's no reason to think that your representation of hands has anything to do with what caused the representation. It could be that what caused the representation is like an evil spirit laughing at you. Right? But our own mind, we have direct access to. Right? What Descartes thinks is our own thoughts are things we can access directly. We don't have to sort of figure out what they're like. We don't have to go through an argument to figure out what they're like, the way we do for physical objects. We know directly what our ideas are. Now, there is this complication that at several points in the meditations, I've pointed out that Descartes is aware of the possibility of unconscious mental events and mental events that you don't have full access to. That might provide a bit of a problem here, although I think the way he would solve it is to just say the aspects of your mind that you're not conscious of aren't actually part of your mind per se. But we'll get into that when I talk a little bit to you about what he has to say about imagination. Okay, so we have direct access to the contents of our mind. We know the essential properties of our mental items, like our ideas, our feelings, things like that. We know their essential nature directly. We don't know the essential nature of physical things directly. We have to figure them out. The essential nature of physical things is their primary qualities: extension, density, velocity, things like that. The essential features of our mental items, though, we could know even when we were, or conceiving of a scenario where there were no physical things at all. Right? There's nothing, Descartes would say, that we have to figure out about the mental things. And so they're not going to have the same nature, Descartes thinks, as the physical things. They're not going to have extension. And if you think about it, like, let's say you're thinking to yourself right now, this video is boring, right? Where is that thought located? You might think, oh, it's in my brain. But like, really? The thought is in your brain? So like, if I hit you sufficiently hard so that your brain actually slides around a little bit in your skull. So this is like what happens to boxers and football players who eventually get like terrible brain trauma, is they get hit hard enough that like the head moves, but the brain doesn't quite move as fast. Like it bounces, right? Bounces around inside your skull. I can hit you hard enough to move your thought like a quarter of a centimeter to the left. Really? It's a weird thing for a thought to do. It doesn't seem like ideas have locations. We're much more likely to say ideas have locations in time, but it's weird to think that ideas have locations in space. It's not so weird for things like feelings, like pain. You're like, where's your pain? It's like, it's in my Achilles, right? My Achilles tendons, I ripped it. Now I can't walk. I'm talking about a lot of injuries here. But thoughts, it's a little weird to literally claim that they have a location. And Descartes would say it's because they don't. They're not physical things. Now this raises a problem. Same problem that Plato should have realized was a problem, but didn't seem to, which is, how does the mind and the body interact? And I'll just tell you, Descartes doesn't have an answer. He tries to give an answer, but his answer is like silly. This problem was raised for him by the Queen of Sweden, believe it or not, who he met when I believe she was still a princess. And she was in the Netherlands at the same time Descartes was, where she was like just, touring Europe because Sweden's cold and kind of boring. And if there are any Swedes listening to this, you know what I'm talking about. And they met, and she was really, really smart, and he gave her the meditations, and like she apparently immediately was like, well, if physical objects are extended in space, and that's how they interact, because this is what Descartes thought, the only way physical objects interact is by running into each other. So like if this is going to interact with this, they have to hit each other. This was behind a long-running dispute between Cartesians and Newton, because of course Newton's scientific theory says objects can interact without coming into contact with each other. Gravitational force can cause things to move without coming into contact with each other. But Descartes thought, yeah, physical objects cause other physical objects to do things by running into them. They have to make contact. And Queen, I believe Christina was her name, was like, okay, that makes sense. That's great. That fits with all the new scientific stuff that's happening with Galileo and Kepler and all that. But if that's true, and thoughts don't have extension, they don't have spatial location because they're not physical at all, she just asked, well, how is it that our thoughts are moving our bodies? Our bodies are extended in space. How is it that our thoughts are moving our bodies? And Descartes said, oh, they're meeting at the pineal gland. So if you're not aware, the pineal gland is apparently the one part of the brain that's not bifurcated. So every other part of the brain, there's a left side and a right side, but the pineal gland doesn't have that. Or at least that's what Descartes thought. And so he thought, oh, okay, so that's the unifying center of the brain. So the soul or the mind must cause changes to the pineal gland, which then the changes sort of radiate out. But this doesn't solve the problem at all, because you just ask like, okay, but the pineal gland is extended. So this doesn't solve the problem. It just tells you where the problem is located. Like Queen Christina's issue still is live, right? Like, how does a non-extended thing interact with an extended thing? How does something that takes up space get moved by something that doesn't take up space? If your whole physical theory is that the only way things that take up space do anything is when stuff runs into them. Queen Christina got her revenge by hiring Descartes, by the way, bringing him to Sweden and to be her tutor. But she only had time in the morning, because I think she actually at some point ruled independently. Like, I think she was the chief monarch. It's not like her husband was doing it. I think she was ruling Sweden for a while. So she was very busy. And so like the only time she had for him was like 5 a.m. And Descartes was used to sleeping until like 1 or 2, which is frankly the lifestyle a lot of philosophers would lead if they had the choice. And apparently having to wake up early in the morning in the cold, damp awfulness of Sweden. Again, Swedes, you have a great society with a wonderful healthcare system and lots of equity and stuff like that, but it's just unpleasant there. I went there when I was a little kid. It's just not nice. I mean, it's nice for like that 1 month a year, but eventually this killed Descartes. Descartes got sick and died. So he didn't take her question seriously, and she found her revenge. This is still a big problem for anyone who believes in dualism, right? The problem is going to be whatever your physics tells you about how physical objects interact, that seems like it's not going to apply to the mental interacting with the physical, if the mental and the physical are radically different. If, on the other hand, the mind is identical to the body or identical to some part of the body, then there's no problem, right? If the mind is just another name we give to either the brain or processes in the brain, like electrical, chemical processes in the brain, then there's no real mystery here. It's just one part of the body affecting another part of the body, the same way physical things interact generally. But Descartes has a problem. All dualists have this problem. And if you want to hear more about how this problem would be approached by later figures, you can take a History of Modern Philosophy class. Okay, so that pretty much, I think, is going to wrap up Descartes. I might have a summing up video to really highlight some of the points of agreement and points of difference between Descartes and Plato and Aristotle. But other than that, moving on to Hume.